It wasn't the howl of the wind or the bite of the cold that made me stop my truck that night. It was the silence. A silence so deep and wrong it felt like the mountain had swallowed its own voice. Out here, silence isn't peace, it's a warning. It's the sound of the world holding its breath before it breaks. And when I saw him, just a dark shape against the white, I knew I was staring at the aftermath of a break. He wasn't just a man lost in a storm. He was a man the storm had tried to erase. Rescuing him was an impulse, a reflex born of a loneliness I knew too well. I thought I was saving him from a frozen death. I didn't know I was pulling a ghost from the snow, a ghost who carried the key to a prison I hadn't even realized I was living in. A key that would not just open my door but obliterate it. Snow had a way of muffling the world, making it feel like you were living inside a cotton ball. But that night, the silence was sharper than a knife's edge. I was headed back from town, a trip I made once a month for supplies, a journey I dreaded more and more with each passing year. The old Ford pickup, my only companion, coughed and sputtered up the winding mountain road, its headlights carving a weak, yellow tunnel through the falling snow. It was a familiar pilgrimage, this slow crawl back to my ranch, a place that had once been a home and was now just a series of rooms I walked through. My name is Clara and I am a widow. The title still tastes like ash in my mouth, even after 4 years. That was the lie I told myself anyway. The truth was more like a cold stone in my gut. My husband Thomas had been a cowboy in the truest sense of the word, a man more comfortable in the saddle than on solid ground. He was a rancher, a man of the earth, and he lived his life by a simple, unshakable code of honesty and grit. Losing him to a sudden heart attack, out in the very fields we worked together, had ripped the floor out from under my life. I was left with a sprawling, beautiful, and completely unmanageable ranch, a mountain of debt, and a heart that felt like it had been hollowed out with a dull spoon. I'd managed, mostly through stubbornness and the kind of grim humor that only arises from profound despair. I was a rancher now by default. I understood the land, but I didn't command it like Thomas had. I just existed alongside it. I kept the cattle through the winters barely. I fixed fences with shaking hands and muttered curses. I handled the books with a growing sense of dread, watching the numbers inch ever closer to the edge of bankruptcy. The ranch, our life's work, was dying a slow death, and I was the undertaker. So I drove, lost in my familiar litany of worries. The storm was a bad one even for the Rockies. The wind was picking up, howling through the pines, shaking the truck as if it were a toy. The snow was coming down in thick, wet blankets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I was about 10 miles from the ranch, a stretch of road that snaked along a steep, treacherous ridge when the silence hit me. It wasn't a lack of sound. The wind was still screaming. The engine was still groaning. But there was a sudden, profound absence where the sound should have been, a void in the white noise. It was the sound of something missing, something that was supposed to be there but wasn't. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I instinctively slowed the truck to a crawl. I don't know what made me look to my left. Maybe it was the way the snow seemed to swirl in a peculiar pattern, or perhaps a trick of the light from my headlights. But through the swirling flurry I saw a dark shape in the ditch. A pile of something that wasn't snow, wasn't rock, wasn't a fallen branch. My heart hammered against my ribs. The silence, the shape, it all added up to a single, terrifying conclusion. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded for a moment, the tires finding no grip before it came to a lurching, heart-stopping stop. I sat there, my hands frozen on the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind, which I always prided on being practical, was screaming at me to drive on, to not get involved. You're a woman alone on a mountain road in a blizzard. It could be a trap, a trick. This is how it happens in the movies. The city girl stops for a stranger and gets her truck stolen, or worse. But the rancher in me, the widow, the woman who knew loss and desperation intimately, saw something else. I saw a man, and that man was dying. I can't explain it. Logic and fear warred for a moment, and then they were both swept away by a wave of something far more potent, compassion. It wasn't noble, it wasn't brave. It was a reflex, a physical ache in my chest. The mountain man in me knew that no one, not even the most hardened soul, deserved to be swallowed by the snow alone. Thomas had been alone when he died. I couldn't bear the thought of another soul going the same way, unnoticed and unloved in the cold. I wrestled my heavy winter coat on, pulled my hat down over my ears, and shoved open the truck door. The wind immediately slammed it shut against my side, nearly knocking me off my feet. I fought against it, gritting my teeth, my breath turning to ice in the air. The snow was up to my knees, and each step was a labor. I trudged toward the shape, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm in my chest. He was in the ditch, partially buried. A man. Young, I guessed, though it was hard to tell through the ice crusted on his beard and face. He was wearing a heavy, dark coat that might have once been a good one, but it was now covered in snow and soaked through. He was lying on his side, curled in on himself, like a child trying to make himself small against the world. I reached him and knelt, my knees immediately going numb in the snow. I put a hand on his shoulder. He was stiff, but I could feel the faintest tremor beneath the surface. He was alive, barely. "Hey," I yelled over the wind. "Hey, can you hear me?" He didn't move. His face was a frozen mask. I could see a gash on his forehead, a nasty one caked with blackened blood. My mind immediately started racing. Hypothermia. The signs were all there. His limbs were rigid, his skin was pale, and he was unconscious. I had to get him warm, and I had to get him warm now. The thought of dragging him up the snowy bank to my truck was daunting. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, and I was just a middle-aged woman who had lost too much weight she didn't have to lose in the first place. But adrenaline, that primal juice of pure survival, gave me strength I didn't know I had. I grasped him under his arms and started pulling. It was the most difficult thing I've ever done. My boots slipped on the ice, my back screamed in protest, and the wind and snow lashed at my face like 1,000 tiny whips. I'd pull him a few inches, then slip, then pull again. It felt like an eternity. With every inch I was bargaining with God, with the universe, with the elements themselves. Just a little further. Just get him to the truck. Don't let him die. Don't let another man die on my watch. Finally, by some miracle or sheer force of will, I got him to the passenger side of the truck. I wrestled the door open and with one last, monumental effort shoved him up and into the seat. He flopped into the cab like a sack of potatoes, his head lolling against the window. I slammed the door shut and fell back into the driver's seat, my whole body trembling, my lungs burning with the cold, sharp air. I sat there for a moment, panting, trying to get my bearings. The cab was freezing, the heater barely working. I turned the engine on and cranked the heat up as high as it would go. Then I looked at him. He was a mess. His clothes were soaked and frozen. His face was deathly pale, his lips a shocking shade of blue. He was a stranger, a complete unknown in my truck, in my world. I had invited a ghost into my life, but looking at him I didn't see a threat. I just saw a human being, a man who had been given up on just like I had been given up on. We were both castaways, washed up on the same inhospitable shore. "Okay," I said out loud, my voice sounding hollow and strange in the small cab. "Okay, just hold on, we'll be home soon." That word, home, sounded foreign to me. It was a word I associated with Thomas, with the life we had built, with the life that had been stolen from me. My ranch wasn't a home anymore, it was a mausoleum, but right now it was the only shelter I had, and it was his only chance. The drive back was interminable. The snow was so thick I could barely see the road, and I was forced to navigate by memory and feel, creeping along at a snail's pace. The stranger was silent the whole way, aside from the occasional, shallow, shuddering breath. I kept glancing over at him, looking for any sign of life, any sign that I hadn't just pulled a corpse from the snow. I talked to him. Nonsense, really. I rambled about the weather, about the cattle, about the broken fence post I needed to fix. I didn't know if he could hear me, but the sound of my own voice was a comfort. It was a tether to reality, a reminder that I was still here, still alive, still fighting. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the sight of my own house was a profound relief. It was a big, old farmhouse built by Thomas's grandfather. It had weathered 100 winters, and it would weather this one too. The front porch light was on, a beacon of stubborn defiance against the darkness, something Thomas had always insisted on. "Let the world know someone's home," he used to say. Getting him into the house was a whole new ordeal. He was completely dead weight, an unwieldy, frozen statue. I half-dragged, half-carried him up the porch steps, through the front door and into the living room. I laid him down on the old, worn sofa, the one Thomas and I used to snuggle on in front of the fire. It felt wrong, somehow, to have this stranger lying there. My mind raced through a checklist of survival skills I had learned from Thomas. His advice, once so practical, now felt like a lifeline from the past. "First thing you do with someone frozen, Clara, is get 'em dry and warm, but careful. Too fast, and you'll do more harm than good." I got a fire going in the fireplace, a roaring blaze that quickly began to fill the room with blessed heat. Then I went to work. I carefully removed his wet coat, his frozen shirt, his heavy boots. I tried not to look at the gaunt, bruised body underneath. It was like unwrapping a broken package. He was thinner than he looked under all that bulk, his ribs showing through his pale skin. He had other wounds, too. A badly bruised ribcage, cuts on his hands that looked like they were from gripping ice or rock. He had been in some kind of accident, that much was clear. Maybe his truck had gone off the road and he'd wandered, lost, until he collapsed. I covered him in thick wool blankets and propped his feet up on a pillow. I made a cup of warm, weak tea and, using a spoon, managed to get a few drops into his mouth. He swallowed, reflexively, a tiny, promising sign of life. And then I sat. I sat in my old armchair across from the sofa and I watched him. The firelight danced across his face, revealing a face that was younger than I had first thought. He couldn't have been more than 30. He had a strong jaw, dark brows, and hair that was dark too, almost black, matted and tangled with ice. This was a man who looked like he belonged on a mountain, who was built for the wild, yet here he was, broken and helpless in my living room. A part of me was terrified. Who was he? What was he doing out there? Could he be dangerous? Another part of me, the older part, the part that remembered what it was like to take care of someone, to have a purpose, was quietly, secretly grateful. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't just going through the motions. I was doing something. I was saving a life. It was a small, fragile thing, this spark of purpose, but in the dead of winter, in the silent heart of my grief, it felt like a miracle. Hours passed. The fire died down to embers and I must have dozed off in my chair. I was woken by a sound, a soft, pained groan. I looked up, my heart in my throat. He was awake. His eyes were open and they were looking at me. They weren't the eyes of a lost boy. They were dark, deep, and ancient, full of a wariness and a pain that went far beyond his physical injuries. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, who had been betrayed by the world. He stared at me, his gaze unblinking, assessing me, calculating. Then his lips parted and he spoke. His voice was a hoarse, ragged whisper, barely audible. The words were in a language I had never heard before, a guttural, rhythmic sound that was utterly foreign. It wasn't Spanish or French or any of the languages I'd heard in town. It was older, wilder, like the wind through the pines. He was speaking Apache. I didn't know it then, but I knew it immediately. It was a language of the land, of the mountains we both inhabited, a language that felt at once alien and intimately familiar. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, and repeated the words, a desperate, broken refrain. I just stared back at him, my own voice frozen in my throat. This man, this mountain man I had pulled from the snow, was a stranger in the most profound way imaginable. And in that moment, I realized that rescuing him hadn't just changed his destiny. It had shattered the walls of my own, silent, snow-covered world, and the silence that followed was filled with questions I had no answer to. The silence that followed his first words wasn't empty. It was dense, heavy with unspoken questions and unacknowledged fears. He was a ghost in my house, a specter who had materialized from the storm, and the air around him felt charged with a history I couldn't begin to understand. He watched me with those dark, ancient eyes, his gaze a physical weight that made my skin prickle. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, a strange creature he was trying to decipher. The first thing I did was try to communicate. I pointed to myself and said, "Clara," slowly, enunciating every syllable. He just stared. I pointed to him and raised my eyebrows, a question. He turned his head away, back to staring at the flickering fire. The gesture was a clear dismissal, but it wasn't hostile. It was something else entirely. Shame, or perhaps grief. It was the look of a man who had lost his name, his past, his sense of self. I had to think. The man was clearly injured, possibly concussed, and suffering from severe exposure. My first aid knowledge was basic: cuts, scrapes, a little animal care. But I'd never dealt with a human being in such a state. I had a well-stocked medicine cabinet. Thomas had always said a ranch was a minefield of potential injuries. I gathered some antiseptic, bandages, and a bottle of aspirin. I approached him slowly, my movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I'm going to help you," I said, my voice low and soothing, like I was talking to a spooked horse. "I need to clean those cuts. It's going to sting." He flinched when I reached for his hand, a flinch so sudden and sharp it made me jump. But then he relaxed, his gaze softening just a fraction. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible shift, but I saw it. He was giving me permission, albeit a hesitant one. I was careful, meticulous, working with a gentleness that surprised even me. I cleaned the gashes on his hands and the wound on his forehead, applying butterfly bandages to the deeper cuts. He didn't make a sound, not a single grunt of pain. He simply watched me, his expression unreadable. When I was finished, I mixed some aspirin into a glass of water and held it to his lips. He hesitated for a moment, then took a sip, his eyes never leaving mine. I was struck by the vulnerability of it. This strong, stoic man was in my care, entirely dependent on me. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders, a feeling that was both unnerving and strangely grounding. Over the next few days, a strange ritual developed. I'd go about my chores, feeding the horses, checking on the cattle, chopping wood, and he'd stay on the sofa, resting. He was weak, his body slowly knitting itself back together, but his mind was what truly fascinated me. He was constantly observing, his eyes tracking my every movement. He wasn't just watching me. He was learning me, memorizing my patterns, my habits, my little quirks. I'd catch him studying the photographs on the mantel, the faces of Thomas and his family that I'd kept frozen in time. A flicker of something, recognition, would cross his face, and then it was gone, replaced by that unyielding wariness. He was a man trying to solve a puzzle, and I was a critical piece he couldn't quite place. His silence was its own language. It was an invitation to talk, to fill the void with my own stories. And I did. I told him about Thomas, about how we'd met, about his death, about my own lonely, desperate life on the ranch. It was like confessing to a priest in a confessional made of wood and firelight. He never gave any sign of judgment or even understanding. But he listened. He listened with an intensity that made me feel heard, truly heard, for the first time in years. One afternoon, about a week after I'd found him, he finally spoke again. I was in the kitchen making a simple stew. He appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. He was still weak, but the light of life had returned to his eyes. He looked different, more grounded. He took a deep breath, and in a voice that was clearer, stronger, but still heavily accented, he said one word. "Water." My jaw dropped. My first thought was profound relief that he could speak English. My second was pure, unadulterated shock. You can speak English," I stammered. He nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "A little," he rasped. I remember." The floodgates had opened, but only a crack. His story came out in fragments, in broken English and frustrated silences. His name was Eli. He was a member of the White Mountain Apache tribe, from a reservation further south. He'd been a tracker, a man who lived off the land, a man of the old ways. He was a ghost in the modern world, a man who felt more at home in the forests and mountains than in the concrete and steel of the cities that were slowly swallowing his ancestral lands. "Why were you up here?" I asked him, my curiosity finally getting the better of me. His face grew distant, shadowed. I was looking for something, he said, a place, a memory. He spoke of his grandfather, an elder who had told him stories of these mountains, of their people who had once roamed them freely, of a sacred place where the spirits of their ancestors dwelt. His grandfather had died years ago, but Eli had felt a restless urge to walk the old paths, to connect with something that he felt was slipping away. My life, it is not my own, he said, his voice low and pained. I feel like I am living in a cage. I needed to remember who I am. He told me about a blizzard, about getting lost, about falling, about the blackness that had consumed him. That was the last thing he remembered until waking up in my house. I listened, my mind reeling. This wasn't just a man who had gotten lost in a storm. This was a man who was lost in his own life, a man searching for a connection to his past, to his identity. It was a search I understood all too well. The dynamic in the house shifted. We were no longer just a rescuer and a rescued. We were two souls, shipwrecked and washed ashore on the same island, sharing the same fire. He started to help me, a little at a time. He couldn't do much at first, but he'd chop the firewood with more strength than I'd seen in him, or he'd mend a broken piece of tack with a skill that made me stare in wonder. His hands were strong and precise, and he worked with a quiet, meditative focus. One evening I was struggling with a particularly stubborn hinge on the barn door. The wind had been howling all day, and the door had been banging, threatening to break free. I was cursing under my breath, my fingers numb with cold, when Eli appeared beside me. Without a word, he took the tools from my hands and examined the hinge. He made a small adjustment, a slight twist, and the door swung smoothly shut. "The metal is worn," he said, his voice calm and patient. "It must be oiled. The wind, it does not forgive." I stared at him, my mouth agape. It was such a small thing, but to me it was monumental. He had fixed something that I, in my stubbornness, had been trying to fix for weeks. It was a reminder of how much I had let the ranch and myself fall into disrepair. I was so focused on my own survival that I had stopped truly living. "You've got a way with things," I said, a little breathless. "The land, the animals, and old hinges, I guess." He looked at me, and for the first time I saw a genuine spark of humor in his eyes. "You have a way with things, too," he replied. "A way of making a broken man feel whole." It was a small, intimate moment, but it changed everything. The walls between us began to crumble. We talked more, sharing stories of our lives. He spoke of the beauty of the mountains, of the sacredness of the land, of his deep connection to his culture and traditions. He taught me about the plants and animals around the ranch, pointing out things I'd never noticed before. He was a living repository of knowledge, a wellspring of wisdom that was centuries old. I, in turn, taught him about the practicalities of running a modern ranch. I showed him the books, the endless invoices and bills. He looked at the numbers, and I saw a spark of understanding in his eyes. "Your ranch is sick," he said softly. "It is bleeding." It was a brutal, honest assessment, but he wasn't criticizing. He was just stating a fact. He helped me see what I had been trying to ignore. The ranch was slowly dying, and my own grief and despair were only hastening its demise. He didn't just fix hinges. He started to fix the ranch itself. He knew the land. He knew how to read the signs, the weather, the patterns of the animals. He knew how to coax life from the stubborn, rocky soil. He showed me a spring I never knew existed, a small, hidden source of water that could sustain a whole herd of cattle. He found a way to mend a fence line I had given up on, using materials and techniques I never would have thought of. His knowledge was ancient, intuitive, and completely invaluable. It was during one of these moments that I realized he was more than a helper. He was a healer. He was healing the land, and in the process, he was healing something deep inside me. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for 4 years began to recede, replaced by something else, a sense of partnership, a feeling that I was no longer carrying the weight of the world alone. But the past wasn't done with us. One evening I was going through a box of Thomas's old things, looking for a specific tool. He was sitting at the kitchen table, and he saw a photograph I had pulled out. It was a picture of Thomas and his brothers, standing proudly in front of the house we were in right now. Eli's face went pale. He stared at the photograph, his fingers tracing the outline of Thomas's face. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper, trembling with an emotion I couldn't decipher. I know this man," he said. My heart seized in my chest. A cold dread slithered down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice suddenly tight. "You knew Thomas?" He shook his head, a slow, deliberate gesture. "No, I saw him, a long time ago. I was a child. My grandfather knew his father." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a new kind of pain, a deep ancestral sorrow. "There is a debt, a blood debt from the old times. It is why I was in this part of the mountains. My grandfather told me to find them. He told me to make things right." The air in the room grew thick. My world, which I had just begun to rebuild, tilted on its axis. The man I had pulled from the snow, the man who had become my partner, my confidant, had a secret, a connection to my husband's family that was steeped in history and shadow. He wasn't just a ghost from a blizzard. He was a ghost from the past, a past I had never known existed. And his presence in my life was no longer a coincidence. It was destiny, a destiny that had just been rewritten. The photograph sat on the worn wooden table between us, a silent, accusing artifact. The faces in it, Thomas and his brothers, were frozen in a moment of youthful, cocky triumph. Their smiles were wide, their arms slung around each other, the picture of a family dynasty on the cusp of its prime. It was a picture of a world I had married into, a world I had become a part of, a world that now felt like an elaborate lie. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A blood debt. I felt a physical chill, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter outside. I pulled my cardigan tighter around myself, a futile gesture. "A blood debt," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "From the old times. You have to explain this to me, Eli. You can't just say something like that and leave me to choke on it." He looked at me, and the ancient sorrow in his eyes was so deep, so profound, that it made my own grief seem like a shallow puddle. He took a long, slow breath, as if steadying himself to dive into a dark and treacherous river. He picked up the photograph, his calloused thumb tracing the line of Thomas's jaw. "My grandfather Hastian was a holy man," he began, his voice a low, rhythmic chant. "A medicine man. He carried the stories of our people, the memories of our ancestors. He remembered a time before this land was divided, before the fences and the towns. A time when the mountain was one, and it belonged to all who lived on it." He set the photograph down and looked out the window at the snow-covered peaks. "There was a man, a white man, a rancher, Thomas's grandfather. His name was Henry. He was a fair man for a time. He respected the land, respected the old ways. He and my grandfather were friends. They shared the mountain, shared the game, shared the stories. It was a time of peace." Eli's jaw tightened. But then Henry's son, Thomas's father, he did not share his father's spirit. He saw the land not as a gift, but as a possession. He saw my people not as neighbors, but as obstacles. He started to push. He took our grazing lands, poisoned our water, drove off the game. He pushed us further and further into the mountains, and when we pushed back, he called the law. "I don't understand," I whispered. "What happened?" Eli's gaze met mine again, and the pain in his eyes was now tinged with a terrible anger. "A young man," he said. "My father's cousin, a boy really. He was a wild one, rebellious. He led a small group of young men to protest. They killed some cattle, a symbolic act of defiance. Your father-in-law, he did not see it as a symbol. He saw it as a threat. He organized a posse. They hunted the boy and his friends down. They didn't arrest them. They took their own justice." I felt the blood drain from my face. The stories my father-in-law used to tell, the proud tales of his youth, of taming the wild land and its wild people, suddenly took on a new, monstrous dimension. The boasts of a pioneer were revealed as the confessions of a tyrant. "They killed them," I said, my voice hollow. "They killed a group of boys." Eli nodded slowly, a single grim movement. My grandfather found the body of the boy, my family's kin, hanging from a tree, a warning, a message for all our people. That was the last time he trusted the white man. He told me that the land was sick, that it was stained with the blood of the innocent. He made me a promise. He made me swear on his dying breath that I would find the family of the man who had done this, and I would make it right. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch worn smooth with age. He opened it and poured a small object into his palm. It was a bone, small and white, carved with intricate symbols. "This," he said, "is a piece of my family's history. It is a reminder of the debt. It has been passed down through generations. And I have carried it across the mountains, waiting for a sign, a chance to fulfill my grandfather's wish." My mind was reeling. The man in my kitchen, the man who had saved my ranch, the man who had brought light back into my life, was a bearer of a generational curse. A curse that connected him to the very family I had married into, the family whose name I still carried. I felt a dizzying sense of being unmoored, of being caught in a riptide of history. "But what does making it right mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me, Eli?" His gaze softened and the anger faded, replaced by a profound weariness. "I didn't know what I would find," he admitted. "I was just following my grandfather's story. I was looking for a way to end the cycle, to break the debt, the old hatred. It poisoned my grandfather's soul. It made him bitter. I saw what it did to him, to my family. I don't want to live that way. I don't want to carry that weight." He looked at the photograph of Thomas, a man he had never met, a man whose family had wrought so much pain. "When I saw you," he continued, "I didn't know who you were. I just saw a woman who was alone, a woman who was struggling just like us. And then I saw this photograph, and I knew. The sign, the circle was complete." I stared at him, my heart pounding. I was standing at the crux of history, at the intersection of two stories that had been intertwined for over a century. I was a widow, a rancher, a woman who had lived her whole life in the shadow of her husband's legacy. And now I was the living representative of the very family that had committed an unforgivable act against his people. My first instinct was guilt, a deep, soul-crushing guilt that was not my own but felt as heavy as if it were. I hadn't killed those boys. I hadn't even known about it. But I was part of the legacy. I was the keeper of the ranch that had been built on stolen land. I was the living, breathing connection to the injustice that had poisoned his family for generations. Then came the fear. What did he want? Did he want revenge? Was I just a target, the final piece in his quest for justice? I looked at him, this man who had shared my fire, who had mended my fences, who had looked at me with something akin to affection. I couldn't believe he meant me harm, but I was terrified of the consequences. The weight of my family's past was pressing down on me, threatening to crush the fragile peace I had built. He must have seen the fear in my eyes. He reached out and took my hand, a gesture so gentle, so unexpected that it made me gasp. His grip was firm, calloused, but his touch was warm. "I am not here to hurt you, Clara," he said, his voice a low, calming rumble. "I am here to heal. My grandfather wanted revenge. He wanted to see the white man suffer as we had suffered. But that is not what I want. I want the pain to end. I want to put the bones of the past to rest." He opened my palm and placed the small, carved bone in my hand. "I am giving this to you," he said. "I am giving you the debt. You will do with it what you see fit. You will not carry it for me, but with me. We will find a way to make it right together." In that moment, something shifted inside me. The fear and guilt didn't disappear, but they were joined by something else. A sense of purpose, a feeling of partnership. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I wasn't just a rancher. I was an agent of change, a person entrusted with a sacred obligation. The destiny I thought was written for me, a slow, lonely decline into debt and despair, was no longer the only path. The bone felt cool and heavy in my hand. It was a piece of history, a fragment of a story I had never known I was a part of. It was a key that unlocked a past I had inherited and a door to a future I was only beginning to imagine. With Eli by my side, the weight of the debt didn't crush me. It anchored me. It gave me a reason to fight, not just for the ranch, but for something far greater, for reconciliation, for peace, for a destiny I had never dared to dream of. Spring came to the mountains like a reluctant guest, hesitant to fully commit. The snows began to recede, melting into muddy rivers that surged through the valleys, carrying with them the debris of winter. The land smelled fresh and new, the air tinged with the sharp scent of wet earth and burgeoning life. But the thaw wasn't just physical. The ice that had frozen my heart, the ice of grief and guilt, was beginning to crack. Eli and I became a team, a strange, unexpected partnership. We worked the land together, side by side, our rhythms sinking into a shared purpose. He didn't just help me run the ranch, he taught me to see it as a living entity. The fence lines weren't just boundaries, they were the veins of the land. The cattle weren't just livestock, they were the heartbeat. He showed me how to read the signs of the season, how to predict the weather, how to coax the stubborn, rocky soil into yielding a better pasture. He was patient, never critical, always gentle. He mended my broken fences, both the ones made of wood and the ones that existed in the troubled places of my heart. He had a way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the world. He made me feel seen, truly seen, for the first time since Thomas died. One evening, we were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was a canvas of deep orange and fiery red, the kind of sunset that made you believe in magic. I was holding the small, carved bone in my hand, turning it over and over. It had become a talisman, a physical reminder of the promise we had made. "You know," I said, my voice quiet in the twilight, "we need to decide what to do with this. We can't just carry this debt forever." Eli was silent for a long moment. He stared out at the horizon, his profile etched against the fading light. "My grandfather wanted revenge," he said finally. "He wanted blood for blood, but I see now that was his sickness, not his strength. The anger, the hatred, it consumed him. It's a poison that spreads from one generation to the next." He turned to look at me, his dark eyes holding a deep, profound peace. "What I want," he continued, "is to bring something new into the world, to plant a seed of peace where there was only conflict. I think that's what my grandfather truly wanted deep in his heart. He just didn't know how to do it." He took the bone from my hand and held it up to the dying light. "We can't change the past. We can't bring back the lives that were lost, but we can change the story. We can choose how to end it." And so we began our work of reconciliation. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was small acts, quiet gestures. We started by inviting the elders from the local Apache community to the ranch. Eli spoke to them in their own language, his voice filled with a humility and respect that was palpable. He explained the debt, the story of the past, and what he was trying to do. I, as the representative of the rancher's family, apologized. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, to stand before them and say the words that had gone unsaid for over a century. I didn't try to make excuses or justify. I just acknowledged the pain, the injustice, and the long shadow it had cast. To my surprise, they weren't angry. They were tired. They had carried the weight of that history for generations, and they were as eager to lay it down as we were. We didn't become friends overnight, but we planted the seeds of a new relationship. We shared meals, stories, and a shared love for the land that had once been a source of so much conflict. We also tackled the physical manifestation of the debt. I gave back a section of the ranch's land, a small part but a significant one, to be held in a trust for the community. It was the land where the worst of the sins had been committed. It was a symbolic act, but it was a powerful one. I could have fought it, could have held onto every inch of my inheritance, but I knew in my heart it was the right thing to do. It was the only way to truly break the cycle. The final piece of the puzzle was the bone itself. One evening, surrounded by a small group of Apache elders, we went back to the site of the original tragedy. We had a quiet ceremony, a prayer, and we buried the bone back in the earth. We buried the debt. The past was acknowledged, honored, and finally put to rest. That night I stood on my porch, a different woman than the one who had hauled a frozen man from the snow. The mountains looked the same, but they felt different. The air was crisp and clean, the stars were brilliant and sharp. The weight of the past that had been pressing down on me was gone. It wasn't that I had forgotten it. It was that I had integrated it. I had faced it, honored it, and made my peace with it. Eli came and stood beside me. His arm brushed against mine, a casual, intimate gesture that had become commonplace. There was no romantic declaration, no grand gesture, just a quiet understanding that our fates were now intertwined, our souls woven together by the threads of a shared history and a shared future. "You did a good thing, Clara," he said, his voice soft in the night air. "You broke the chain." "No," I said, turning to look at him. We did it together." I looked out at the ranch. The fences were strong, the cattle were healthy, and the land was starting to heal. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for 4 years was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and a quiet, simmering hope. My destiny had been rewritten, not by some outside force, but by a choice, a single, defiant choice to embrace compassion over bitterness. The story of the widow and the mountain man had become a story of two people who had found each other in the midst of their own personal storms, and together they had found a way to bring light back into the world. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was real. It was messy. It was hard, but it was ours, and that was enough. The snow was gone, and the world was waking up. And for the first time in a long, long time, so was I.